Have you ever felt truly alone in the middle of nowhere? Picture this: a cozy Christmas retreat in a snow-covered cabin, isolated from the chaos of the world. It sounds perfect until the silence starts to feel oppressive and the shadows outside seem to shift. Imagine hearing faint crunching in the snow when no one else should be there, footsteps circling the cabin, tapping on the windows, and a chilling realization that you might not be alone after all. What started as a peaceful escape turned into a nightmare no one could have prepared for. By the end, you'll be questioning whether solitude is ever truly safe. I've never minded spending Christmas alone. Some people think it's sad, but I've always liked the quiet. Growing up, the holidays were chaotic: too many relatives, too much noise, and a little too much wine on my dad's part. So, when I moved out and started working remotely, I made a habit of spending Christmas by myself. Last year, I decided to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was advertised as a cozy, secluded retreat, perfect for unwinding. I found it on a listing site, and the pictures looked great. A small, snow-covered cabin nestled in a forest with a fireplace and a stocked kitchen. The reviews were glowing, though sparse. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. My phone needed a break from the constant work emails, and I needed a break from people. Looking back, I wish I'd told someone. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from the city, the last hour spent on winding, icy roads. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the snow. It looked just like the photos: quaint, isolated, and surrounded by a dense forest. The kind of place where you'd expect to find peace. The owner had left the key under a mat by the door, as promised. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old wood, and the fireplace was already set up with logs and kindling. A small Christmas tree sat in the corner, decorated with tiny lights and ornaments that looked handmade. I unpacked my things, made a cup of cocoa, and settled into the couch by the fire. It was exactly what I'd wanted: just me, the crackling fire, and the soft glow of Christmas lights. But that first night, I realized how quiet the woods could be. It wasn't just the absence of city noise. It was oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for something, anything to break it. Occasionally, I'd hear the faint groan of the cabin settling or the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Around midnight, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought I heard something else, a crunching sound. It was faint, like footsteps on snow, and it came from somewhere outside. I froze, my heart pounding. The cabin was remote. There shouldn't have been anyone around. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. Telling myself it was just an animal, I climbed into bed and pulled the covers over my head like a child. The next morning, the world outside was bright and untouched. The snow around the cabin lay undisturbed, with no sign of footprints. I spent the day reading, making soup, and enjoying the solitude. By evening, I'd convinced myself that I'd imagined the sound, but as night fell and the silence returned, my nerves crept back. I locked the doors and windows, checked them twice, and settled into the couch with a blanket. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a while, I felt calmed until the crunching started again. This time, it was closer, deliberate. I muted the Christmas music playing softly from my phone and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing occasionally as if whoever or whatever it was stopping to look inside. I slid off the couch and crouched by the window, careful to stay out of sight. Peeking through a gap in the curtains, I saw nothing. The snow reflected the moonlight, making it easy to see the outline of the trees and the shadows they cast. But there was no one there. The crunching stopped suddenly, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I debated leaving, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. There were no footprints in the snow again, no sign that anyone had been outside. Maybe the sound had been the trees creaking in the wind, or snow falling from the branches. To distract myself, I went for a walk in the woods, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The cold air burned my lungs, and the stillness of the forest felt less threatening in the daylight. I told myself I'd overreacted, That night, I made dinner, lit the fire, and tried to relax. But the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, closer, and they didn't stop at the cabin. I heard them climb the porch steps, slow and heavy, and then the faint rattle of the doorknob. My blood turned to ice. The door was locked. I checked it twice, but I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy cast iron skillet, and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response, just the sound of footsteps retreating into the snow. I spent the next day trying to figure out what to do. Driving back in the dark wasn't an option. The narrow roads were treacherous even in daylight. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I sat by the fire with a flashlight and the skillet by my side, listening. The footsteps didn't come back, but something worse did. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping on the window. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it came from the window nearest the couch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped, and the sound of footsteps moved to another window. Tap, tap, tap. They circled the cabin, tapping on every window, pausing just long enough to let the fear sink in before moving to the next one. When the tapping reached the bedroom window, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, threw on my coat, and ran to my car. The snow was falling heavily, and the car struggled to start. I glanced at the cabin, expecting to see someone watching me from the windows, but it stood dark and empty. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, the tires skidding on the ice. As I drove down the winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and collapsed on the bed. In the morning, I called the listing site to report what had happened. The representative sounded confused. "We don't have any listings in that area," she said. I checked the site again, but the listing was gone. When I tried to find the cabin on a map, it wasn't there. I've always loved Christmas, but last year changed that forever. I was driving home to visit my family for the holidays, which had become a sort of annual tradition for me. Living alone in the city, I'd always looked forward to seeing them, the warm house, the familiar smells of baked cookies, the sound of my nephew's laughter. But last year, the universe had other plans. A freak snowstorm came out of nowhere. The weather reports hadn't even hinted at it, and by the time I realized how bad it was, I was already on the highway. My wipers struggled against the accumulating snow, and visibility dropped to almost zero. What should have been a 3-hour drive turned into a slow, creeping nightmare. By the time the sun went down, I was barely crawling along at 20 miles an hour. Every muscle in my body was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. And then my heart sank as my gas light blinked on. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't filled up before leaving the city because I was rushing to beat traffic. Now I was in the middle of nowhere, on a snowy highway with no idea how far the next gas station might be. I scanned the sides of the road desperately, looking for any sign of civilization. That's when I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance, glowing faintly through the swirling snow. Motel, it read. The letters were unevenly lit, and the sign buzzed faintly as I pulled into the lot. The building looked like something out of a bad movie. It was a single-story structure with peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a row of doors leading to identical, cramped rooms. A few cars were parked in the lot, their windows frosted over. I turned off my car and stepped out, shivering as the cold bit through my jacket. The air smelled faintly of mildew and exhaust, and the wind howled around me as I trudged toward the office. Inside, the warmth was a relief, but the atmosphere was far from welcoming. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the small room reeked of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. A man stood behind the counter, his face half hidden in the shadow of a baseball cap. He didn't look up as I entered, his attention focused on a small black and white TV mounted on the wall. "Need a room?" he asked without turning around. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling from the cold. He finally glanced at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. $40 for the night, cash only. I handed him 2 crumpled 20s, and he slid a key across the counter without another word. Room 8 was at the far end of the building. The door stuck when I tried to open it, and I had to shove my shoulder against it to get it to budge. Inside, the room was as grim as I'd expected. The bed was covered with a threadbare blanket, and the carpet was stained in more places than I cared to count. A small TV sat on a rickety stand, and the only other furniture was a single wooden chair and a lamp that flickered every time the wind rattled the windows. I told myself it was just for one night. I could leave first thing in the morning once the storm let up. I locked the door, checked it twice, and then tried to settle in. The room was cold, the heater barely working, and the walls were so thin I could hear the low hum of voices from the neighboring rooms. It was around 11 p.m. when I started hearing the sounds. At first, it was faint, just the creak of floorboards somewhere outside. I figured it was one of the other guests and tried to ignore it. But then the noises grew louder, footsteps slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow outside my window. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft knock. My heart raced as I stared at the door, my mind scrambling to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was the clerk or someone who'd gotten the wrong room. But something about the knock felt off. It wasn't urgent, like someone who needed help. It was slow, deliberate, as if whoever was out there knew I was inside and wanted me to know they knew. I stayed quiet, hoping they'd go away. Another knock, louder this time. "Who is it?" I finally called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the window, careful not to make any noise. The curtains were thin and didn't completely cover the glass, but I managed to peek out without being seen. The snow was still falling heavily, but I could make out a figure standing just outside the door. They were tall and dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by the shadow of a hood. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the door. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. The knock came again, harder this time, and the doorknob rattled as the person outside tried to open it. Panic set in. I looked around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. The chair was too flimsy, and the lamp wasn't much better. Then I heard the sound of a key sliding into the lock. My blood ran cold. How did they have a key? The door creaked open just an inch, and I saw the edge of a gloved hand pushing it inward. Without thinking, I lunged for the door and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt into place. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was silence. Then, I heard footsteps retreating into the snow. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. I stayed huddled on the bed, clutching the chair leg I'd broken off as a makeshift weapon. When morning finally came, I gathered my things and left without looking back. As I passed the office, the clerk was still there, watching his tiny TV. He didn't even glance at me as I walked out, but as I pulled onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later, when I stopped for gas at a station miles away, the attendant asked if I'd come from the old motel. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He looked at me, his expression grim. "That place has been closed for years. I don't think I'll ever spend another Christmas alone again." It started because I thought I needed a break. Work had been relentless. My social life was non-existent, and I just couldn't face the usual family chaos this year. The loud conversations, the forced cheer, the nosy relatives asking when I was going to settle down. So, when my boss offered me a few days off, I jumped at the chance to stay home and do absolutely nothing. It seemed perfect at first. I bought some snacks, queued up a few movies, and told everyone I'd be unreachable. I wanted peace, just me and the quiet. But by the time Christmas Eve rolled around, the silence felt less peaceful and more oppressive. It wasn't like the silence of a normal night. It was deeper, heavier, as though the world itself had gone to sleep and forgotten to wake up. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how alone you truly are. The first strange thing happened around 10 p.m. I was sitting on the couch, halfway through a cheesy Christmas movie, when I heard a faint thud coming from upstairs. I froze, staring at the ceiling. My apartment isn't very big, just a single floor with a small attic that I never use. The sound was soft but deliberate, like something heavy had shifted above me. I told myself it was nothing, probably the wind rattling something loose. Still, I grabbed the flashlight from under the sink and climbed the ladder to the attic. The hatch creaked as I pushed it open, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Dust motes floated in the air, and the space smelled faintly of mildew. I swept the light around, but nothing seemed out of place. Just a bunch of old boxes and furniture I hadn't bothered to get rid of. I lingered for a moment, listening, but the attic was as silent as the rest of the apartment. Satisfied it was nothing, I climbed back down, locked the hatch, and went back to the couch. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. A dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart started to race. I stared up at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. For a moment, I considered calling someone, but who? The police? What would I even say? That I heard a strange noise? I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't just sit there either. Clutching the flashlight, I climbed the ladder once more, my hands trembling. The attic was the same as before, dark, dusty, empty. But the sound was still there, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far corner. I forced myself to move toward it, the beam of the flashlight trembling as I shone it into the shadows. That's when I saw a box I didn't recognize sitting in the middle of the floor. It was old and battered, covered in cobwebs, and definitely not something I'd put up there. My stomach churned as I crouched down and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of random objects: a rusty pair of scissors, a cracked mirror, a bundle of yellowed papers. Nothing that explained the sound or how it had moved on its own. I backed away, my skin crawling, and closed the hatch as fast as I could. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound starting again, imagined something or someone up there, waiting. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted but relieved. Daylight made everything seem less threatening. I decided to put the whole thing behind me, chalk it up to my imagination, and focus on making the best of the holiday. But the unease lingered. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the walls, I noticed something odd. My front door was unlocked. I always lock it, out of habit. I told myself I must have forgotten, but deep down, I knew better. I locked it again, double-checking this time, and tried to shake off the growing anxiety, but the feeling that something wasn't right kept gnawing at me. It was around 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve when I heard the footsteps. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine, when the sound stopped me cold. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the attic. My throat tightened. This wasn't just creaks or groans from the house settling. Someone was up there. I grabbed the heaviest knife I could find and stood at the base of the ladder, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Silence. For a moment, I debated calling the police, but something held me back. I didn't want to seem paranoid. What if it really was nothing? I climbed the ladder, one step at a time, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The attic was dark and still. Nothing moved, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The box, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, every light in the apartment on, the knife never leaving my hand. The hours crawled by, and with each one, the silence grew heavier. By morning, I was a wreck. The thought of staying in the apartment another night made my skin crawl. I decided to leave, to spend Christmas Day at a hotel or maybe drive to my parents' house. But when I went to grab my keys, they weren't on the hook by the door. I searched everywhere under the couch cushions, in my coat pockets, even in the trash. But they were gone. That's when I noticed the window, the one in the living room, near the couch where I'd been sitting all night. It was open, just a crack, enough to let in the icy air. My keys were lying on the windowsill, just inside the room. I don't remember leaving the apartment. I don't even remember driving. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car at a gas station miles away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I called my parents and told them I was coming over. I didn't explain why. I couldn't. When I finally got to their house, they hugged me, asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and went straight to my old bedroom. I didn't care about the questions or the looks they gave me. All I cared about was being somewhere that felt safe. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had happened in the apartment was behind me. But then I noticed the box. It was sitting in the corner of the room, exactly where it had been in the attic. I didn't sleep at all that Christmas, and I haven't spent a Christmas alone since.